Hello and welcome to Politics Today. This programme is filmed only a day away from the national lockdown in England. But what we'll be talking about in this programme today is the investigation carried out by the Equality and Human Rights Commission looking into the discrimination against Jewish members of the Labour Party, as this was announced on Thursday, the 29th of October, that the Labour Party was guilty of anti-Semitism. So to join me in this programme, I'm joined by Robin Benson, Christian political commentator, as well as Steve Maltz, who's a Messianic Jew. So gentlemen, welcome to the programme. I'll start off with you, Robin, because, I mean, for all of us who have a love and a passion for Israel and the Jewish community, and we're certainly concerned about the huge rise of Jew hatred we're seeing in our society and around the world today, that this is a very important topic to discuss, primarily because the Equalities and Human Rights Commission has found the Labour Party guilty of unlawful discrimination against its Jewish members. And to think that this NGO was actually set up on behalf of the Labour Party from when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and that of Gordon Brown. So what are your thoughts on the findings of this damning investigation?
Well, I mean, those of us who've been watching what was going on, certainly in the run-up to the previous, general election last year, could have told them, months ago, it was clear, it was obvious that this was a major problem within the Labour Party. There were just so many documented examples that we knew of through social media in particular, but also in the press, particularly the ultra left-wing press, that made it clear that this was a problem. And what beggared belief, I think, on the part of many of us was how the leadership of the party in particular could be in total denial that this was going on. And now it's not only proven that they were in total denial, some of them have been fingered as being actively obstructing the investigations within the party setup into these incidents, trying to shelve them all out of the way altogether, or just blocking the investigations. And so what came out from the report was, it was shocking, yes, but it wasn't something that was a great surprise. Anybody who'd got any wit observing the political climate here in this country on the left of politics in particular, not just the left, but particularly on the left, knew what was going on.
And I want to bring you into the discussion, Steve. It's great to have you on the programme, and particularly to give us a kind of Jewish perspective. I mean, have you or has any member of your family faced anti-Semitism for being Jewish?
Well, funnily enough, I'd probably say no for myself, but my parents came from the war generation, and they definitely did see anti-Semitism. In terms of the Labour Party, my dad has been a staunch Labour supporter all his life until a few years ago, and where it's just impossible for just a normal Jewish person to vote for a party that has basically turned to the dark side. And it's just a shame, because he's not a natural conservative supporter, but there's no alternative. So
I think that's one of the sad things. I mean, whatever your politics are, that particularly folk within the Jewish community who have been lifelong Labour supporters, you've got lifelong Labour MPs who resigned their membership of the party, walked away from the party, some of them after decades, and they didn't become conservatives. They had nowhere to go. They had no political home to rest themselves in, which is just, you think, that it is such a disgrace and such a shame that folk are left in that sort of situation.
And they're talking, Steve, about, I believe that what Kier Starmer has done and his approach that he's taken to anti-Semitism in the party, saying that he will give zero tolerance to anti-Semitism in the party. He needs to make a clear distinction from that of his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, to distance himself from this row, to prove to the Jewish community and to the country that the party is no longer an anti-Semitic party. But isn't this a problem of the hard left controlling the apparatus of the party, and particularly now that Jeremy Corbyn, who's been in the party for 55 years, has been suspended from the party, could cause him a huge political battle within the party itself.
Yeah, I mean, basically, words are no good by themselves unless they're actions. And as someone who's not particularly a political animal, when I was observing Jeremy Corbyn over the last 2 or 3 years, all these grand statements he made about, his openness to the Jewish community, lack of anti-Semitism, and yet on one hand he was saying that, and on the other hand his actions are doing the absolute opposite. And it's like a disease, and we can't just say it's Jeremy Corbyn by himself. I'm sure there were plenty who have, I suppose he opened the door for, the hard left to come in. And again, looking from the outside, when I go back to, was it 4 years ago when he was voted in, or
2016?
It was almost like a joke, wasn't it? And I remember hearing a lot of Tory voters actually becoming Labour supporters in order to vote him in, because they knew if he came in, they're certain to, fail. But he came in, and suddenly it became a nightmare. So I don't know what the thinking was behind all that, and whether it was the hard left that pushed Jeremy Corbyn in to start with.
I think it was the membership fee was reduced down to £1 to encourage a wider audience and a wider participation within the Labour Party that brought in the Communist Party and the Social Workers Party and others associated with the Trotsky movement and the Communist movement came in under Corbyn's leadership. But there can be no doubt, Robin, that there was a huge amount of bullying that took place. According to my notes here, the report identified 23 incidences where Corbyn's office interfered directly with the complaints and 2 acts of unlawful harassment through its agents. And we've seen documentaries produced on it. The media have reported really the problem of anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and now we have a damning indictment by the Equality and Human Rights Commission in their investigation on the Labour Party.
And still he's in denial. I mean, this is the mind-boggling thing, that as soon as the report's findings came out, he comes out with this statement, back again, more words claiming that he's not this way, and yet you've got 3 or 4 years worth of actions, whether it's turning up at that memorial meeting where he helped lay a wreath wherever that was.
That was in Tunisia.
And other statements, and turning up at demonstrations that were clearly anti-Jewish, and all the supporting a mural on the wall. And you think, where does this man in his head, where does he live, that he cannot see that what he says and what he does do not marry together? And it just blows your mind.
Yeah, but the thing is, he had prior form, so surely you knew what was going to happen. You knew, out of all the politicians you can think of, Jeremy Corbyn, for me as a non-passionate, non-political person, I thought, if he got in, I knew about his background. Yeah. We all knew about his background. We knew it wasn't going to be a good situation.
Yeah, he had form, as they say.
Yeah, form.
But isn't this the question of this, that this reflects the spiritual condition that Jeremy Corbyn is in and those of his supporters, primarily because they allow that Jew hatred to come into their hearts. Yeah. It's spiritually manifest. And it says in Genesis 12, of course, 1-3, that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. Yeah. And there can be no doubt that this issue has actually cursed the Labour Party. But I suppose one of the most disturbing things is that someone who can't even mention the word Israel, who shows antagonism to Israelis, to the Israeli government, and also so many members, and even including MPs that are supportive within the Labour Party of Israel, find themselves almost hounded out of the party because they're Jewish. And to think that Jeremy Corbyn that this time last year was campaigning to be our Prime Minister, what would have happened, do you think, if he then had actually won the keys to 10 Downing Street? And what state would our nation be in when you allow someone with such hatred in their hearts to Israel to have the keys to power of this nation?
I know, it's a terrible situation. And when you think of what happened when Boris got in, 3 weeks later we had COVID. So to think of how Labour would have coped with COVID, just can't think about it at all. But in terms of anti-Semitism, you can go back in history, you can go back to the 60s, and you can actually see the seeds of it actually getting into the Labour Party. Not as the Labour Party was then, the old Labour of Keir Hardie and Harold Wilson, etc. But when these the new left, they call it the new left, people like Jeremy Corbyn was just starting out, I think, and Ken Livingstone, etc. They brought in this philosophy. One would call it cultural Marxism, a form of Marxism. It certainly wasn't mainstream Labour, and it was always on the fringe, And it was only recently, as soon as you made that mainstream, you realised that brought in the anti-Semitism that was never there. Like I said, my dad was very, very happy with the Labour Party. They're very pro-Israel up to a point. Certainly the Labour Party after the war were okay with, I do believe, with the state of Israel and the kibbutz movement and all that stuff. But
until Attlee's government prevented all the Jewish people from fleeing the Holocaust and then
that's true.
Weren't able to enter Israel.
But things sort of ebbed and flowed. Things really changed after the 67 war.
Yeah.
That's when British politics began to turn against Israel.
Yeah.
And then you had the 73 war, and then things really changed because Israel was then cast in the light of being the big baddie. And as Brits, we love the underdog, so the Palestinians then became the pet love, of the British establishment, certainly the political left, and even to some degree the centre ground of British politics. So, as Steve has said, it's been a progression of change, and then Corbyn comes in, and the floodgates were just opened. And it wasn't just Jewish MPs; there were secular MPs, or possibly even Christian MPs, who took a pro-Israel stance within the Labour Party, and they too were hounded out. So it was right across the board. It was where you stood on the issue of Israel was the plumb line as to how the Labour movement treated you.
I think also what this report shows, that it didn't just harass and unlawfully hound supporters of Israel within the Labour Party, actually identifying Jewish supporters, with many even having death threats over their lives. We've seen that Yossana Berger was forced out of the party, as well as Joan Ryan and many other kind of moderates within the party tried to stand up against Jeremy Corbyn and Momentum, which acted like a dictatorship within the party, that anyone who didn't support Corbyn were out, and no one could actually question his leadership. Now, to me, that sounds like an authoritarian regime in the way that he set everything up. So we've seen that this investigation has announced their findings after it was first launched in May of 2019. The Labour Party now has until the 10th of December to come up with a plan detailing how we'll implement the Commission's recommendations, which includes an independent process to deal with anti-Semitism complaints and in training for those who are involved in it. We've seen that Keir Starmer has said that he's willing to do this, but can he?
Well, I think it's a case of, honestly, time will tell. I mean, he's in a very difficult situation, and I feel for him in some senses. He has to live with a legacy, as some commentators, some folk in the Jewish community have pointed out. He has to live with a legacy that he was more or less almost Jeremy Corbyn's right-hand man during those years when he was the leader of the party, after he was elected in. So he stood by while all of this was going on and was perceived not to be saying anything, not to be challenging it. And now he's done what he's done in suspending Corbyn's membership of the party and saying that he'll go along with this. And that's a difficult legacy to have to live with. On the other hand, as a Jewish friend forwarded me some correspondence that he had, one of the correspondents pointed out, well, if Keir Starmer had taken a stand, he wouldn't be leader of the Labour Party, because the anti-Israel group would have made sure that he wasn't elected to the leadership. So it's a sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But it's sort of, as far as I can see, he's put the cat among the pigeons by doing what he's done. And it's yet to be seen where the party goes with this, whether it actually splits the party, and kills it effectively as a party unit with some sort of group hiving off, supporting Corbyn, or whether they actually can maintain some sort of unity and get through this process, get beyond it with these sorts of stipulations followed and set in place so that this never happens again. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think we just need to wait and see.
Absolutely. And Steve, one disturbing aspect of this is the power of the unions within the Labour Party. We saw that during the 80s, Neil Kinnock really reduced the power and the influence over the trade unions, over the Labour Party. And again, we see they're having huge power because Len McCluskey, leader of the Unite Union, has warned that by suspending Jeremy Corbyn from the party, this has effectively meant that the party is now in chaos and could actually lead to civil war. And the unions may pull out their £30 million support for the Labour Party. Troubling times ahead for Kier Starmer.
Well, I was going to say, you go back to Genesis 12.
Yeah.
Basically, it's playing out within the Labour. They let it in, and now they're bearing the consequences.
Yeah. I think that's a very, to bring a spiritual dimension into it, I think that's really important.
And also, what do you think should be done regarding Jeremy Corbyn? Because he's now found that he's actually broken the law. Because he was the one in charge. He may have used his henchmen to carry out his dirty business to kind of protect himself, but ultimately he was head of the Labour Party for 4 years. He bears responsibility for hounding out Jewish members and Jewish supporters, and many of those that were involved in the complaints procedures within the party, shown in a recent Panorama documentary, felt like they wanted to commit suicide. So the intimidation, the aggression shown to them by wanting to get to the truth of what was actually happening, they were prevented from doing so. So surely it's essential in our functioning democracy to deal with this issue, because we know that once you allow Jew hatred to emerge, its ugly head, poisons and destroys not only the Labour Party in this case, but also the whole of our society if we allow it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, we just need to see how this unfolds. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has threatened to take the Labour Party apparatus to court over his suspension. So we need to wait now and see if that's likely to go ahead. If it does go ahead, that will probably drag on for weeks, if not months. But I suppose the fact that this NGO has come out with this report, I'm sorry, I can't remember this long, highfalutin name that they've got.
Equality and Human Rights.
Thank you, Simon.
I had to learn that myself.
The fact that they've come out with this report does leave open the possibility for either individuals or groups to club together, and actually, if the police will not pursue the matter through the courts, then they could take it through the civil courts. Now, whether anybody really wants to do that, again, I'm not sure, because it will just make the wound that is already there fester even more than it is, and whether they actually want to somehow come to a point of putting this to bed completely and getting rid of it. Again, it's a time will tell situation, but there are lots of possibilities. And none of them actually are going to be helpful for the Labour Party. That's for sure. Because if it goes to court, the whole thing is going to get dragged out all over again. All of this that's gone on with these MPs, local councillors as well, is going to get brought back out into the open. And again, it's going to portray the Labour Party as being a very dark place for those who have for whatever the reasons, have a pro-Israel stance.
And what's interesting as well with this one, Steve, is the fact that 2 years ago, Jeremy Corbyn was forced to accept the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which effectively say that if you call Israel a racist state, or that Israel has no right to exist, then that is, under their definition, anti-Semitism, or the better word, Jew hatred. But this has no power because it's only recommendations. So surely one of the things the government, this Conservative government could do is to push through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition on anti-Semitism into law, so there are consequences for those who break it, like Jeremy Corbyn and the former leadership of the Labour Party. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking, anti-Israelism is just a euphemism for anti-Semitism.
Yes, yeah.
So you're really showing people in their true light. If they're attacking Israel, they're really attacking the Jewish people. And you saw that when things were happening, like in Gaza, and there was a spark of something in Gaza, and you think, well, is it just an Israel thing? No, you saw synagogues in France being burned and looted, and so you saw it wasn't, for the anti-Semites of the world, Israel, Jewish people, it's the same thing. Anti-Semitism, it's just another name for it.
Yeah. And Robin, do you think that this investigation by the Equality and Human Rights Commission and its findings will actually bring reassurance to the British Jewish community, who are really feared for their lives, their safety, living here in England?
I think it will bring. It will bring some measure of reassurance to them. But how the party actually handles this, what the ultimate conclusion is to this process, will either reaffirm their willingness to give the Labour Party another chance, or it will pull their support even further back from it. And yeah, I think we're too early in the process yet to know which way that's going to go. But on the other hand, it's not going to deal with the Jew hatred that is endemic in our society.
Yeah.
So it's not just politicians, not even local politicians. It is a problem across the nation that has to be addressed. I don't know how it's addressed, but it is a problem that we as a society have got to grapple with. And unless we do, then actually I don't think the Jewish community in the UK is ever going to be totally at ease with being here.
Also, the Jews are always a litmus test as to the state of a nation, the spiritual state. And I live in a Jewish area, and for the last 5-6 years, our local Jewish schools have to have security guards outside, patrolling outside. And that wasn't around in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So it just shows you the spiritual state of the nation. Just happens to be focused in the Labour Party, but I think it's a little bit wider than that. It's just that we're just focusing on the Labour Party, but I think it's wider than that.
Absolutely. And talking about Sir Kier Starmer now, the leader of the Labour Party, they're saying that this investigation by the Equality and Human Rights Commission could be his clause for moment. This was in reference to Tony Blair when he became leader of the Labour Party in 1994, how he got rid of the Marxist clause, which says that overthrew the concept of national and state ownership and the pledge to the Labour Party to support that endeavour in order to bring in business to say that the Labour Party had been reformed. Could we see that Keir Starmer could be a reformer if he's able to tackle this big issue of Jew hatred within the party? Surely that will show not only the Jewish community but also the public that he's willing to fight and stand up for big issues, despite the fact that this could actually tear the whole party apart.
Yes, potentially, yes. It could be his moment, but I have to put in the caveat on that one that it really, because the unions, and certain unions in particular, like the one that you mentioned, Unite, have now got so much power and influence, particularly financial influence, but behind that is power over policy, that if they are not willing to back him up and go along with him, then any attempt by him to make his mark is just going to be undermined. So he has a real battle on his hands.
Yeah. And with 4 minutes left of the programme, how should we be praying? Because as believers, we should be praying into these situations. We should be praying for our leaders and praying for Keir Starmer, the head of the Labour Party as well, that he's able to have the strength and resolve to deal with this issue. Because if he doesn't, then the issue of Jew hatred becomes a major political issue. And of course, this affects the spiritual health of our nation.
Absolutely. And like I said about the litmus test, and these people don't know what they're dealing with, basically. We have an understanding of where anti-Semitism comes from spiritually, And as far as I know, these people are not believers. And I don't know how many believers there are in the Labour Party who can basically stand up for this. But they're playing with fire, and the more they get sunk into this swamp of hatred. They say they're the party of anti-racism. Why isn't anti-Semitism racism? You know, you can't sort of differentiate between Jew hatred and hatred of blacks and Muslims or etc. You know, but you know, as biblical believers, we just know it is a blight on world history, and we know it's also a blight on the church, and that is a subject that that could be on another programme. But it's the oldest hatred of all, and we now see it focused in one area of society. But I believe, as I said before, that there's more to it than that. And you know, when that film, there was a video that you recommended us to look at, and it showed a party conference from 2 years ago. And when the issue of talking about Middle East politics came up, suddenly you saw all the Palestinian flags all being raised up, hundreds of them.
Yeah.
And so every one of those that held up a flag had anti-Semitism in their heart. And that shows you it's a bigger problem than people realise.
So we really need to kind of pray for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party and the leadership that they get to grips with this, because, you know, otherwise not only will it consume his leadership, but his ambitions to become our next Prime Minister will go out the window. So it's important that he gets grips with this, as well as reassuring the Jewish community as well.
I think one of the things that we can pray is there's much darkness, both spiritual, social, cultural, political darkness, all wrapped up in this situation. And I think one of the things that we should pray into is that God shines his light into this and exposes this, gets it out into the open so it can be cleaned out of the way, hopefully, you know, once and for all, but certainly for a good length of time. So that's certainly one thing that we can, as believers, that we can pray for. That truth is seen to prevail in the situation, and not a political fudge.
So Robin and Steve, thank you so much for being my guests on Politics Today. And I want to thank you for watching today's programme, because some of the issues that we raised in this programme are so important, not only for Keir Starmer to know that those who bless Israel and the Jewish people will be blessed, but those who curse Israel and the Jewish people will be cursed. And he has an opportunity to mark a different course than his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, by reassuring the Jewish community that he will fulfil his stand, which is zero tolerance to anti-Semitism, and restore those relationships with Israel. And then we can see that his party will flourish if he blesses Israel and the Jewish people. So I want to thank you for watching Politics Today.